Hejin stared at her reflection in the polished metal wall of the elevator. Her black uniform made her look even smaller than she was, but at least it was clean and pressed perfectly. She straightened her back and lifted her chin, just as her grandmother had taught her. Stand tall, Sunmai would say, even when you feel small. The elevator continued its smooth climb up the crystalline spire of the Celestial Sciences Academy. Through the transparent walls, Hejin could see the 3 moons of Centauri Prime rising over the horizon, their purple and blue surfaces catching the light of the system's twin suns. Even after 3 months at the academy, the sight still took her breath away. A soft chime announced her arrival at the lecture hall level. Hejin took one final deep breath and stepped out. The corridor was already busy with students rushing to their morning classes. Beings of all shapes, sizes, and colors moved through the space with practiced ease. Some floated, others crawled, and many walked on varying numbers of legs. Hejin kept close to the wall as she made her way to theoretical physics. It wasn't that she was afraid. She just preferred to avoid attention. But as usual, that wasn't possible. "Oh, look who it is," a musical voice called out. "The primitive has arrived." Hejin didn't need to turn to know it was Tekra. The Proximan student's voice always carried that same tone of amused contempt. She kept walking, pretending she hadn't heard. "Hey, I'm talking to you, Earthchild." Tekra moved to block Hejin's path. His blue skin seemed to shimmer under the hall lights, and his 4 eyes blinked in an unsynchronized pattern that always made Hejin slightly dizzy. Did your primitive ears not evolve enough to hear properly? Several other students stopped to watch, their various appendages and sensory organs turned toward the confrontation. Hejin could feel their curiosity and anticipation. "I heard you, Tekra," Hejin said quietly. "I just have nothing to say. Please let me pass." Tekra's mouth stretched into what his species considered a smile. "Nothing to say. But humans always have so much to say about everything. Your kind never stops talking about your great achievements, your amazing culture, your wonderful Earth." He leaned closer. "Even though you can barely leave your own solar system without help." Hejin felt her face grow warm, but she kept her expression neutral. "We're going to be late for class." "We?" Tekra laughed, the sound like tinkling crystals. "You mean you're going to be late for failing another practical test? How many times have you blown up the quantum simulator now?" 3. 4. Someone in the crowd called out, triggering a wave of alien laughter. Hejin's hands clenched into fists inside her uniform pockets. The simulator incidents weren't her fault. Not really. The equipment just didn't seem to work properly when she used it. Dr. Nix had said it was probably a calibration issue, but nobody had been able to figure out why. "Move aside, Tekra." A new voice cut through the laughter. Jeho, a tall student with silver skin that rippled like water, stepped forward. "Some of us actually care about our education." Tekra's upper eyes narrowed while his lower ones widened, a sign of annoyance in his species, always defending the primitive Jeho. "Perhaps you should have gone to Earth University instead. I hear they're still trying to understand basic fold space theory there." But Jeho had already created a space in the crowd, and Hejin took the opportunity to slip past. She heard Tekra call out something else, but she was already hurrying down the corridor. She didn't stop until she reached the lecture hall's entrance. Inside, she found her usual seat at the back of the room. The desk adjusted itself to her human proportions, one of the few pieces of academy technology that seemed to work perfectly for her. As other students filed in, Hejin pulled out her data tablet and began reviewing her notes from the previous class. "Don't let them get to you," Jeho said, settling into the seat next to her. His silver skin caught the light from the holodisplays, creating tiny rainbows. "They're just jealous because you scored higher than anyone else on the theoretical portions." Hejin gave him a small smile. "Thanks, but we both know theory isn't enough here. I have to pass the practicals to stay in the program." Before Jeho could respond, the room darkened, and Dr. Nix materialized at the front. The professor's form shifted constantly between solid and gaseous states, a characteristic of their species that still fascinated He-Jin. Today, Dr. Nix began, their voice resonating directly in the students' minds. We will discuss the theoretical foundations of quantum entanglement navigation. But first, I'd like to address an interesting anomaly that occurred during yesterday's practical sessions. He-Jin sank lower in her seat, knowing what was coming. During standard quantum field manipulation exercises, we recorded an unprecedented spike in the background resonance field. This spike coincided with student He-Jin's attempt to establish a stable quantum link. Dr. Nix's form solidified briefly as they displayed a complex graph in the air. While the exercise was logged as a failure due to equipment malfunction, the energy readings we recorded were fascinating. He-Jin felt the attention of the class turn to her. Even Tech-Ray had stopped making snide comments to his friends to stare at the displayed data. The pattern, Dr. Nix continued, bears a striking resemblance to theoretical models of natural quantum manipulation, something we've only seen in ancient historical records. You mean she broke the equipment in a new way? Tech-Ray called out, triggering scattered laughter. But Dr. Nix's form darkened, a sign of serious interest in their species. No, Mr. Tech-Ray, I mean that for a brief moment, we recorded something that shouldn't be possible with our current understanding of quantum mechanics. The professor's words hung in the air, and He-Jin felt a strange tingling sensation in her fingers. The same feeling she'd experienced right before the simulator had overloaded. Now, Dr. Nix said, their form becoming gaseous again, open your texts to Chapter 7. We'll begin with the basic principles of quantum field theory. The rest of the class proceeded normally, but He-Jin found it hard to concentrate. Her grandmother's stories kept floating through her mind. Tales of humans who could walk between stars without ships, of a time when Earth wasn't isolated from the galaxy by choice, but was at its center. When the lecture ended, He-Jin gathered her things quickly, hoping to avoid another confrontation with Tech-Ray. But Dr. Nix's mental voice reached out to her before she could leave. Ms. He-Jin, a moment please. She approached the front of the room as other students filed out. Ji-Ho gave her an encouraging nod as he left. Yes, Professor. Dr. Nix's form solidified completely, something they rarely did. Your grandmother. Her name is Sun-Mei, correct? He-Jin blinked in surprise. Yes, but how did you? The energy pattern from your practical session. I've seen it before, long ago. Dr. Nix's solid form shifted slightly, creating patterns that reminded He-Jin of her grandmother's garden. Would you be willing to participate in some additional tests? Outside of regular class hours. He-Jin hesitated. Extra attention was the last thing she wanted, but there was something in Dr. Nix's manner that reminded her of the way her grandmother would look when telling her special stories, stories she'd been told to keep secret. These tests, He-Jin said carefully, would they help me pass the practical exams? Perhaps. Dr. Nix's form began to shift back to its gaseous state, or perhaps they will help us understand why the equipment responds so uniquely to you. Later that evening, He-Jin sat in her small dormitory room, staring out at the 3 moons. She held her grandmother's pendant in her hand, a simple crystal that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Sun-Mai had given it to her the day she left for the academy, with strict instructions to keep it hidden. The time isn't right yet, her grandmother had said, but you'll know when it is. He-Jin had assumed it was just another of her grandmother's mysterious sayings. But now, after Dr. Nix's words about ancient records and natural quantum manipulation, she wasn't so sure. She held the crystal up to the moonlight. For a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw patterns in it that looked exactly like the quantum field graphs from class. But that was impossible, wasn't it? A message flashed on her room's communication panel. Additional practical session scheduled. Laboratory 7. Tomorrow. 20 o'clock hours. Dr. Nix. He-Jin closed her fingers around the crystal pendant. Tomorrow, perhaps, she would begin to understand why the Academy's technology never worked quite right for her. Tomorrow, she might learn if her grandmother's stories were more than just stories. But for now, she had regular homework to complete. She carefully tucked the pendant back under her uniform and pulled out her quantum mechanics textbook. As she began to read, her fingers tingled again, and for a split second, the text on her screen seemed to shift into patterns that felt more natural than any equation she'd ever studied. Then it was gone, leaving her with questions she wasn't sure she was ready to ask. But ready or not, He-Jin had a feeling the answers were coming. Laboratory 7 was different from the other labs He-Jin had seen at the Academy. While the regular training rooms gleamed with new equipment and floating holo displays, this one felt older. The walls were made of actual metal rather than adaptive smart materials, and the lighting came from simple luminous panels rather than ambient field generators. He-Jin stood in the center of the room, her grandmother's crystal pendant feeling heavier than usual against her chest. Dr. Nix's gaseous form swirled around ancient-looking equipment that lined the walls. "This laboratory," Dr. Nix said, their thoughts gentle in He-Jin's mind, "hasn't been used in over 200 years. It contains what we would now consider primitive testing equipment." "Why bring me here, then?" He-Jin asked, running her finger along a dusty console. "Shouldn't we use the modern labs if we want accurate readings?" Dr. Nix's form condensed slightly. "Sometimes old ways reveal truths that new technology cannot see. Your grandmother would understand this." He-Jin's hand froze on the console. "You knew my grandmother?" "Not directly," Dr. Nix replied. "But I knew of her. Sun Mai was one of the last to be trained in the old ways, before Earth chose isolation." The room suddenly felt colder. He-Jin wrapped her arms around herself, remembering all those nights when her grandmother would tell her stories under the stars. Stories about humans walking through space without ships, about Earth's choice to step back from the galactic community, about abilities that seemed more like magic than science. "Those weren't just bedtime stories, were they?" He-Jin whispered. "No." Dr. Nix moved to an old terminal and activated it. Green light flickered across the metal walls. "Watch." The air in the center of the room shimmered, and an image appeared. It showed a human woman standing in what looked like empty space, but stars swirled around her like water. She wasn't wearing any protective gear, yet she seemed perfectly comfortable in the vacuum. As He-Jin watched, the woman reached out and seemed to touch the fabric of space itself, creating ripples that spread out into infinity. That's my grandmother," He-Jin gasped. The woman was much younger, but He-Jin would recognize Sun Mai anywhere. How is this possible? This recording was made 50 years ago, before the final shutdown of the old programs, Dr. Nix explained. "Your grandmother was among the last generation of what we called Star Walkers, humans who could naturally manipulate quantum fields without technological assistance." He-Jin's head spun with questions. "But why don't we learn about this in history class? Why does everyone think humans are primitive?" "Because that's what Earth wanted." Dr. Nix's form darkened with what might have been sadness. "Your leaders chose to hide these abilities, to step back from galactic affairs. They erased the records, closed the training centers, and let the galaxy forget what humans could do." The image of Sun Mai continued to move through space, dancing with the stars themselves. He-Jin reached for her pendant, and for the first time, she really looked at it. The crystal seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. "The simulator accidents," she said slowly. "They weren't really accidents, were they?" "No." Dr. Nix moved closer. "The equipment wasn't malfunctioning. It simply couldn't handle what you were doing naturally. Your grandmother gave you that pendant for a reason, He-Jin. It's a focus crystal, used by Star Walkers to help control their abilities." Before He-Jin could respond, a loud bang echoed through the lab. They turned to see Tekra standing in the doorway, his 4 eyes wide with shock. "I knew there was something wrong about you," he said, his musical voice harsh with accusation. "I followed you because I thought you were cheating somehow. But this..." He gestured at the still-playing recording. "This is impossible. Mr. Tekra." Dr. Nix's form crackled with energy. "You are not authorized to be in this facility." But Tekra wasn't listening. He pulled out his personal data device. "The Council needs to know about this. Humans hiding abilities like this. It's a threat to galactic security." "No." He-Jin moved without thinking. She reached out toward Tekra's device, wanting to stop him from sending any messages. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The air between her hand and the device shimmered, just like in the recording. He-Jin felt a tingling sensation spread from her pendant throughout her body. Suddenly, she could see the quantum fields that connected everything in the room. They looked like delicate threads of light, and somehow she knew she could touch them. Tekra's device floated out of his hand, suspended in a web of quantum energy that He-Jin could now see and feel. The Proximan student stumbled backward, all four eyes fixed on the impossible sight before him. "How? What are you doing?" he stammered. He-Jin was asking herself the same question. The quantum fields felt familiar, like an old song she had forgotten she knew how to sing. With a thought, she let the device float back to Tekra, who caught it with trembling hands. "What you just saw," Dr. Nix said firmly, "is classified under the highest levels of academic security. If you breathe a word of this to anyone, you will find yourself explaining to the Council why you were breaking into restricted areas and spying on confidential research." Tekra's blue skin had turned a pale shade of gray. He nodded quickly and backed toward the door. Before leaving, he gave He-Jin one last look, not of contempt this time, but of something that might have been fear. When he was gone, He-Jin sank to the floor, her legs shaking. "What just happened? How did I do that?" "You remembered," Dr. Nix said simply. "Your body always knew how to interact with quantum fields naturally. The Academy's modern technology actually gets in the way of these abilities, trying to force something that should flow naturally." He-Jin looked at her hands, still tingling with energy. "My grandmother, she knew this would happen. She knew you had the potential. That's why she supported your application to the Academy, despite Earth's general policy of isolation." Dr. Nix's form solidified completely, showing how serious they were. "But now we must be very careful. Others will notice your abilities as they grow stronger." "The star navigation competition," He-Jin said suddenly. "It's in 3 months. That's why she wanted me to wait, isn't it? She knew I'd need time to remember." "Yes." Dr. Nix moved to the old console again. "And now we must help you remember quickly. The competition will be your chance to show the galaxy that humanity's gifts weren't lost. They were just waiting for the right moment to return." Over the next hour, Dr. Nix showed He-Jin records of other Starwalkers. She saw humans performing feats that seemed impossible, creating stable wormholes with a gesture, communicating across vast distances without technology, navigating the most dangerous space lanes by sensing quantum currents that modern ships' computers couldn't detect. "Your grandmother left something else for you," Dr. Nix said as their session was ending. They handed He-Jin an old data crystal. "She gave this to me 20 years ago, saying I would know when to pass it on." He-Jin held the crystal carefully. "What's on it?" "Training records, personal journals, techniques that were never recorded in official documents. Everything your grandmother wanted you to know about your heritage." Dr. Nix's form began to fade. "Study it carefully. We'll meet again tomorrow night." Later, in her room, He-Jin sat cross-legged on her bed, the old data crystal connected to her personal reader. Her grandmother's young face filled the screen. "My dearest He-Jin," Sunli's recorded image said, "if you're watching this, then you've begun to feel the star song in your blood. Don't be afraid. Let me teach you what my grandmother taught me, what all our ancestors knew before we chose to step back from the stars." He-Jin stayed awake all night, watching and learning, while outside her window, the 3 moons of Centauri Prime traced their paths across the sky. With each passing hour, she felt more connected to the quantum fields around her. They were like old friends she had forgotten, now returning to remind her of who she really was. And somewhere, in a garden on Earth, an elderly woman named Sunma smiled up at the stars, knowing that her granddaughter was finally discovering her true heritage. 2 weeks had passed since Ho-Jin's first training session in Laboratory 7. The old room had become her second home, a place where she could finally be herself without fear of judgment. Every night, after regular classes ended, she would slip away from the crowded halls of the academy and practice the ancient arts her grandmother had left for her to learn. Tonight, Ho-Jin sat cross-legged in the center of the lab, her focus crystal hanging free outside her uniform. Dr. Nix hovered nearby, their gaseous form perfectly still as they observed. "Feel the currents," Ho-Jin whispered to herself, repeating her grandmother's words from the training videos. "The quantum field isn't separate from us. It flows through all things, connecting everything." The air around her began to shimmer. To her now trained eyes, the quantum fields became visible as streams of flowing light. They wove through the room like rivers of starlight, carrying information and energy in endless patterns. "Very good," Dr. Nex's thoughts touched her mind gently. "Now try to change the flow, just as your grandmother showed in recording 17. Ho-Jin took a deep breath. This was the hard part. Seeing the fields had become natural, but manipulating them still felt like trying to catch water with her bare hands. She reached out, both with her physical hand and with her mind. The streams of quantum energy responded to her touch. They bent around her fingers like curious animals, creating swirling patterns in the air. Ho-Jin smiled, remembering how she used to play with soap bubbles in her grandmother's garden. This felt similar, but instead of bubbles, she was playing with the very fabric of space-time. "Excellent progress," Dr. Nix said. "You're advancing faster than I expected. It feels like remembering rather than learning." Ho-Jin admitted. "Like my body always knew how to do this, and I just forgot for a while." "That's exactly what it is. These abilities are part of your genetic heritage. All humans once had them, before they chose to suppress these gifts." A knock at the laboratory door made Ho-Jin lose her concentration. The quantum streams scattered like startled fish. Jeho's silver face peered into the room. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, his liquid metal skin rippling with concern, "but you need to see this." He held up his datapad. On the screen was a message announcing the details of the upcoming star navigation competition. Ho-Jin's heart sank as she read the new rules. "They've changed the format," Jeho explained. "Instead of individual trials, it's now team-based. Each participant must have a partner from a different species." Ho-Jin looked at Dr. Nix. "They know, don't they? Tekra must have told someone despite your warning." "Not directly." Dr. Nix's form darkened. "But rumors have been spreading. Some students reported seeing strange energy patterns around the old laboratory wing. The Academy administration is concerned." "I'll be your partner," Jeho said suddenly. Both Ho-Jin and Dr. Nix turned to look at him. "What? I've known something was different about you since the first day. The way the quantum simulators react to you, how you can solve theoretical problems that even the professors struggle with." Ho-Jin stood up, her crystal pendant glowing softly in the dim light. "You don't understand what you're offering, Jeho. This isn't just about the competition. Then help me understand." He stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him. "Show me what you've been doing in here every night." Ho-Jin looked at Dr. Nix, who gave a slight nod. "Very well," she said. "But what you're about to see, you can never tell anyone." She closed her eyes and reached out to the quantum fields again. This time, instead of just bending them, she gathered them into a tight spiral in front of her. The energy streams condensed until they formed a small window in the air, a window that showed the surface of Earth's moon, as clear as if they were standing there. Jeho's silver skin rippled with amazement. That's impossible. You created a quantum viewport without any technology." "No," Ho-Jin corrected him. I didn't create anything. I just showed you what was already there. The quantum fields connect everything in the universe. We humans can naturally see and use these connections. But why hide such an amazing ability? This could revolutionize space travel. It already did long ago, Dr. Nix interjected. Humans were the ones who first taught other species how to navigate through quantum space. But they had their reasons for stepping back, for letting the galaxy forget. He-Jin let the viewport fade away. My grandmother's records say it was because of fear. Not our fear, but the fear we saw in others. Some species began to see humans as too powerful, too dangerous. There were rumors of plans to restrict human rights, to control us. So Earth chose isolation instead. Jai-Ho was quiet for a long moment, his silver skin shifting through subtle patterns that He-Jin had learned meant deep thought. The competition, he said finally. You're planning to reveal the truth there, aren't you? Not all of it, He-Jin said. Just enough to start changing how people think about humans. To show that we're not primitive, just different. Then I'm definitely being your partner. Jai-Ho's skin settled into the firm pattern of decision. You'll need someone to help deflect suspicion during the preparation phase. And he smiled. I admit I'm curious to see what other impossible things you can do. Over the next few hours, He-Jin demonstrated more of what she had learned. She showed Jai-Ho how she could sense the quantum wake of ships passing through nearby space, how she could read the complex patterns of energy that flowed through living beings, and even how she could create small folds in space-time. The competition's main challenge is usually a complex navigation course, Jai-Ho said as they practiced. Teams have to plot the safest and fastest route through a series of quantum disturbances. With your abilities, we're not going to cheat, He-Jin interrupted. I'll use my gifts openly, but fairly. That's the whole point, to show that these abilities are natural for humans, not some kind of trick. As they were finishing their practice session, an alert sounded on all their devices. The Academy administration was calling an emergency assembly for the next morning. All students were required to attend. They're going to announce something about the competition, Jai-Ho guessed. Maybe more rule changes. Or maybe they're going to try to stop it entirely. He-Jin said quietly. She touched her crystal pendant, feeling its reassuring warmth. They might have figured out what's really happening. Dr. Nix's form swirled thoughtfully. Whatever they announce tomorrow, we must be prepared. He-Jin, your training has progressed remarkably, but you're not yet at your grandmother's level. Are you sure you're ready for what might come? He-Jin thought about all she had learned in the past 2 weeks. She thought about her grandmother's stories, about Earth's hidden history, about the fear that had driven her people into isolation. Then she thought about Tekra's mockery, about all the other humans who might have these gifts but didn't know about them. I'm ready, she said firmly. It's time for the galaxy to remember what humanity really is. That night, as He-Jin lay in her bed, she pulled up her grandmother's recording one more time. Sun Li's young face smiled at her from the screen. Remember, my dear one, her grandmother's voice said softly, our greatest strength isn't in the power we hold, but in how we choose to use it. The galaxy forgot us because we let them forget. Perhaps now it's time for them to remember, not to fear us, but to understand us. He-Jin touched the screen gently, wishing she could reach through it and hug her grandmother. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, possibly even dangers. But for the first time since coming to the academy, she felt truly ready to face whatever came. Outside her window, the 3 moons of Centauri Prime aligned in a rare formation. The quantum fields rippled with unusual patterns, as if the universe itself was preparing for change. In her hands, the crystal pendant glowed steadily, a beacon of truth that could no longer be hidden. The assembly hall was packed with students from every corner of the galaxy. He-Jin sat between Jai-Ho and Dr. Nix, her crystal pendant hidden beneath her uniform. The morning light from Centauri Prime's twin suns streamed through the hall's crystal dome, creating rainbow patterns on the floors. Academy Director Val Soar, a tall being made of pure light, stood at the podium. Their voice resonated through the hall without need for amplification. Recent events have brought to our attention certain anomalies in the quantum field around our academy, the director began. These disturbances coincide with unauthorized uses of Laboratory 7, a restricted facility. Hejin felt hundreds of eyes turned toward her. News had spread fast, despite their attempts at secrecy. The star navigation competition will proceed as planned, Val-Sor continued, but with additional monitoring. Any unusual quantum manipulations will be thoroughly investigated. We cannot risk the safety of our students. They're afraid, Jai-Ho whispered, his silver skin rippling with concern. They don't understand what you can do. That's exactly why we need to show them, Hejin replied quietly. The director was still speaking. Furthermore, all participants must use standard navigation equipment. Any attempt to manipulate quantum fields without approved technology will result in immediate disqualification. A murmur ran through the crowd. Such a rule had never been needed before. No one could manipulate quantum fields without technology. No one except. They can't stop you from using your natural abilities. Dr. Nex's thoughts touched Hejin's mind. That would be discrimination against your species' biological traits. Hejin nodded slightly. She had studied the Academy's laws carefully. They couldn't forbid her from using abilities that were part of her natural makeup, just as they couldn't stop Illuminion from glowing or a wavelength being from shifting form. After the assembly, students crowded the registration area for the competition. Hejin and Jai-Ho signed up as a team, ignoring the whispers and stares around them. Tekra watched from a distance, his 4 eyes blinking rapidly in what might have been anxiety. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. During regular classes, Hejin practiced with the standard navigation equipment, making sure she could use it if needed. At night, in Laboratory 7, she refined her natural abilities with Dr. Nex's guidance. Finally, the day of the competition arrived. The Academy's great navigation chamber had been transformed into a complex course. Quantum disturbances, artificial wormholes, and spatial anomalies created a maze that teams would have to navigate safely. Remember, Jai-Ho said as they waited their turn, we just need to finish the course. We don't have to win to make our point. Hejin touched her pendant through her uniform. No, we need to do more than just finish. We need to show everyone that human abilities aren't something to fear. They're something that can benefit everyone. Their turn came. Hejin and Jai-Ho stepped onto the navigation platform, a circular space surrounded by holographic displays. Other teams had used these displays to plot their courses, relying on the Academy's advanced technology to guide them through the quantum maze. Team 7, the judge announced, you may begin. Hejin closed her eyes and let her natural senses expand. The quantum fields became visible to her inner sight, showing the true nature of the course. What the technology displayed as dangerous obstacles, she saw as natural flows and patterns that could be worked with rather than fought against. There, she said, pointing to what looked like a violent quantum storm to everyone else. That's our path. Jai-Ho, trusting her completely, entered the coordinates she indicated. The platform began to move, carrying them into the course. The audience gasped as they headed straight for what their instruments showed as certain destruction. But Hejin felt the quantum field singing around them. With small gestures hidden from the crowd, she guided their platform through the storm, working with the energy patterns rather than trying to force their way through. What looked like chaos on the monitors was, to her eyes, a beautiful dance of interconnected forces. Impossible, someone in the crowd shouted. Their readings are off the scale. Hejin opened her eyes, letting everyone see the soft glow that had begun emanating from her pendant. The quantum fields became visible around her, swirling in patterns that no technology could fully capture. She's manipulating the fields without equipment, Tekra called out. That's against the rules. No, Dr. Nex's voice rang through the chamber. She's using her natural abilities as a human being. just as your species can see in 4 dimensions naturally. Tekra. Humans once walked the quantum paths without technological aid. The chamber fell silent as Ho-Jin and Jiho's platform glided smoothly through the most difficult part of the course. What had taken other teams hours to navigate, they completed in minutes. Director Val Soar's light form flickered with what might have been concern or amazement. Stop the competition. We need to investigate this. No, He-Jin said, her voice carrying clearly through the space. You need to remember, my grandmother, Sunma, was one of the last Star Walkers before Earth chose isolation. We didn't lose our abilities. We hid them because others feared what they didn't understand. She raised her hands, and the quantum fields around the platform became visible to everyone. The patterns were beautiful, like a dance of starlight and shadow. This is what humans can do naturally, she continued. We don't force the quantum fields, we don't fight against them. We work with them, feel them, understand them in ways that technology can't replicate. Jiho's silver skin glowed with reflected quantum light. That's why the simulators never worked right for her. They were trying to impose artificial control on something that should flow naturally. The platform completed the course in record time, coming to rest at the finish point. The chamber erupted in chaos, some students shouting about cheating, others demanding to know more, and many simply staring in wonder. Director Val Soar raised their hands for silence. Ms. He-Jin, you understand that this revelation will have serious consequences. The galactic community will have questions about why Earth has hidden these abilities. Yes, He-Jin said firmly. And it's time we answered those questions. My grandmother and the other Star Walkers of her generation have been waiting for the right moment. This isn't about showing that humans are superior. It's about remembering that every species has unique gifts to share. She turned to face the crowd, letting her pendant glow freely now. The Academy teaches us about quantum mechanics, about the forces that connect everything in the universe. But you've been trying to control these forces with technology alone. We humans can show you another way. Not better, just different. Over the next few hours, as Academy officials debated what to do, something unexpected happened. Students began approaching He-Jin, not with fear, but with curiosity. Even Tekra came forward. I apologize for my behavior, he said, all 4 eyes focused on the ground. I thought you were cheating somehow. I never imagined that humans could do something your technology couldn't. He-Jin smiled. There's a lot we need to learn from each other, Tekra. That's why we're all here at the Academy, isn't it? Later that evening, He-Jin sat in Laboratory 7 with Dr. Nix and Jiho. Her datapad was open to a message from her grandmother. My dearest He-Jin, Sunma had written, by now you've shown them what we can do. The Council of Star Walkers has been watching. We're ready to come out of isolation, to teach again as we once did. You've opened the door. Now, let's see where the path leads. He-Jin looked out the laboratory window at the 3 moons of Centauri Prime. The quantum fields shimmered with possibilities, showing her paths that led to a future where humans and other species work together again, sharing their gifts openly. What happens now? Jiho asked, his silver skin reflecting the starlight. He-Jin touched her pendant, feeling the warm pulse of energy that connected her to everything around her. Now, she said, we start remembering who we really are. All of us. And somewhere in the quantum fields that wove through space and time, she felt her grandmother smiling.